Unfortunately, the running back position also got bit by the injury bug, but on the bright side, we did have some breakthrough performances last week. So we're going through the top 30 running back rankings for Week 4 fantasy football, and I'm doing everything I can to get us ready for Week 4, so please go down there and drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Now, getting into our first tier, I've still got Christian McCaffrey at number 1, one spot over Jonathan Taylor, who has been awesome this year. Now, with Christian McCaffrey, the reason I'm going to put him and keep him over Jonathan Taylor for the time being is because this offense flat out needs him. I mean, even if they didn't completely need him and they had George Kittle, they had Juwan Jennings, they had Brock Purdy, they would still use him into oblivion because that's what Kyle Shanahan does. He can't help himself when it comes to Christian McCaffrey. So the workload that he sees on a very consistent basis, one of these games he's going to pop off. And it could be very easily against Jacksonville, but either way, McCaffrey to me is still the top dog at the running back position over Jonathan Taylor. And I've expressed this over the week as well. I am still a Daniel Jones doubter, but I did say this: if Daniel Jones comes through and plays a really good game versus the Los Angeles Rams in Los Angeles, I am done doubting them. I think they're a good team this year, and he's this year's Sam Darnold. Now, of course, that has to do with Jonathan Taylor because Daniel Jones has played really well so far, opening up the run for Jonathan Taylor. So Jonathan Taylor has been a little bit of a byproduct, and I know it sounds disrespectful to say that, but the reality is if this guy was playing with Anthony Richardson this year, do you actually think he'd be doing these type of numbers? Now, I'm not here to take anything away from Jonathan Taylor. He's been amazing. But I will say this, I've got him at number 2 for now, out of respect to him and also out of respect to McCaffrey's situation, because I still believe in that San Francisco offense more than I believe in Indianapolis's, but I could be very wrong, and Jonathan Taylor could be the number 1 back again. I've got Bijan Robinson at number 3 and Jahmyr Gibbs at number 4 to round out the top tier of guys here. And listen, with Bijan Robinson, this offense looked as bad as it gets last week. I mean, Michael Penix, I was so embarrassed by calling this guy a legitimate quarterback in the league, and then he comes out and does that last week. It was an embarrassing performance. He got benched for Kirk Cousins. Now, I don't know what's going to happen this week if it carries over. Last week was a great matchup in theory for Bijan and the rest of the Atlanta offense, and they couldn't come through on that. So Washington, I don't think the matchup's bad, but Bijan Robinson is on an offense that I don't trust not only the quarterback right now, but the play calling either I think is atrocious. That being said, Bijan is way too important to be outside of tier 1. And Jahmyr Gibbs at number 4 versus the Cleveland Browns. Listen, with Jahmyr Gibbs, this guy, I think I was just wrong about this offense, and I'm ready to admit that right out of the gate. I think Detroit's offense looks very similar to how it looked last year with John Morton as the offensive coordinator this year. So I'm very impressed with John Morton and what he's done with this offense, and Jahmyr Gibbs remains a focal point of this offense. Now they get to go back home to Detroit off a great win and take on the Browns, who just gave the Packers a lot of trouble and beat them, but I think Jahmyr Gibbs has a really good game, and the Detroit Lions end up winning this game. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I've got Saquon Barkley at number 5 and Josh Jacobs at number 6. Now, Saquon Barkley was accidentally left off this list by me last week. It was embarrassing, and a lot of people were wondering, you knew outside of the first tier he was not going to fall that far. Saquon Barkley this week, this isn't a mistake. I've got him at number 5 at the top of tier 2, but I didn't want to put him in tier 5 this week because last week we really saw him get bottled up in that game. And I don't think Tampa's defense is close to the defense that the Rams have, for example, but I will say that I think that this offense is just a little unpredictable sometimes. I think Philadelphia, A.J. Brown could be in store for a good couple of games because he's probably been griping quite a bit. So Saquon Barkley, if he becomes that kind of second-tier option in the offense behind A.J. Brown, he definitely won't be as dominant, but of course he's still at number 5 because he is a dominant player. Josh Jacobs at number 6 at the Dallas Cowboys. It's a Sunday night game, and this is the perfect matchup for a running back. It really doesn't get better than this. Like DeAndre Swift last week against the Dallas Cowboys had every opportunity. He's just not as good as Josh Jacobs is. Josh Jacobs is just a flat-out better player. And I get it. The whole Packers team is coming off a bad performance in fantasy versus the Cleveland Browns. I'm still going to be leaning towards playing Josh Jacobs in the majority of my lineups. Last week just doesn't deter me enough. And then James Cook at number 7 to round out this tier versus the New Orleans Saints. Listen, when it comes to James Cook, this guy honestly is probably too low ranked. This guy has been awesome in fantasy football, and I think the part that still kind of just feels weird is the fact that the guy is still getting in the end zone at the same freaking clip that he did last year. And a lot of people just thought, how is that possible to do again? Well, he's doing it. I mean, he's doing it right here, so you cannot doubt this guy anymore. He's playing the Saints, too. This matchup, in theory, is fantastic. He should be absolutely fantastic again. The fact of the matter is, to be completely honest with you, and I'm not saying I'm right for doing this, but the reason I've got him at 7 is because you look at his workload, and it's still not consistent enough for me to consider him a dominant fantasy player, whereas when I look at Jonathan Taylor's workload through the first 3 weeks, that guy is consistently a dominant fantasy back. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I've got Derrick Henry at number 8 and Kyren Williams at number 9. And Derrick Henry, I think this fumble thing, it's clearly in his head because this guy just has fumbled 3 straight games where he did not fumble much before that. So with Derrick Henry, it's very, very interesting because the guy looked great on one particular drive at the beginning of the game versus Detroit and then was really not effective the rest of the way there. So I don't know what to think of Henry right now because on one hand, I'm like, I think I still see the same talent. And then on the other hand, I'm like, this thing is clearly in his head. So Kansas City being the defense that they are and the success that they've had versus the Baltimore Ravens over the years, I'm a little skeptical of Derrick Henry's upside this week. And then with Kyren at number 9 versus the Indianapolis Colts, listen, if the Indianapolis Colts defense weren't as good, I would put them higher. But Indianapolis' defense has been, for the most part, very good throughout the first start of the season. So I think Kyren Williams, based off last week, proved that he can do it against a dominant defense. I mean, he just went in the end zone and had a good day against Philly's defense. So Kyren belongs in the top 10. I just do still think there's a little bit of a threat of Blake Corum getting an end zone touch and taking it away from Kyren. At number 10 and 11 to round out this tier, I've got Devon Achane versus the Jets and Bucky Irving versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Now with Devon Achane, listen, this guy had to drop a little bit in my rankings because I think this offense is gross. And I think Devon Achane is clearly the best option. And listen, the good thing about last week was that I think that was his floor because that guy getting receiving work and basically bringing his points to 16 points in a full PPR format, well, that's a game changer for you. But this guy clearly is not on the best offense in football anymore. And the Jets, while they offer a pretty solid matchup this week, I just don't know if I can see Devon Achane and this offense taking many strides forward. I mean, they're losing hope fast in Miami. That's a bad vibe area right now. I just don't think I can realistically have Devon Achane inside the top 8. Inside the top 7 when he's on an offense that's this gross. And then I've got Bucky to round out the tier versus Philly. And listen, Bucky Irving is seeing the work. I called him a buy low this week. And listen, I realistically don't know if many teams can pull off a buy low with Bucky Irving. But my point in saying that was to say, if you look at the workload that the guy is getting and his fantasy output so far, through the first 3 weeks, it hasn't matched up. Like, Bucky Irving should realistically be a 25 to 30 point type of guy on almost a weekly basis based on his workload. Bucky Irving, I still do see struggling a little bit against Philly's defense, particularly on the ground. But the reality is that this guy is seeing so much work through the passing game, and he's becoming more important by the day in this Tampa offense with now the absence of Mike Evans that I can't keep him outside of the top 12. And honestly, this one might actually be a good one to post in the polls. Devon Achane versus Bucky Irving. What you could do is go to fsroundup.com and post a free poll. It's completely free to do this. Post the poll Devon Achane versus Bucky Irving. I'm actually going to do it right now. I'll walk you guys through it. So you just go to Bucky Irving, then you click on chat, then you click on week 4, and then you click on Devon Achane in the start or sit, and have people vote on it. And go vote on other people's as well to help out with their decisions, because these polls are completely free, and you also get to see live updates of what the rest of the community is doing on FS Roundup and with their lineups as well. And if you want to take it a step further with me and you want to get your full team breakdown from me with trade ideas, waiver wire acquisitions, anything to help your team get better, you can join FS Roundup, the premium subscription, and I will break down your team for you after your 12-day free trial ends, and you are officially a customer with us at FS Roundup.
This is Ted. Look at him. Ted desperately needs to pick up a new running back. or his fantasy team is toast. For the third year in a row. And losing his season again means one thing. Don't be Ted. Use Fantasy Football Roundup to automate your waiver pickups and rest easy this season. Huh. Look at him.
Now, dropping down to our next tier, I've got number 12, Kenneth Walker, and 13 is Jordan Mason. And Kenneth Walker is going to Arizona tomorrow night to take on the Cardinals. Now, apparently, Zach Charbonnet is healthy again this week. So he's going to play, and there's no reason to believe that based on the first 2 weeks with Zach Charbonnet, that Kenneth Walker won't be seeing a split backfield. Now, that being said, I do still think that what I said earlier in the week, if you watch my defense rankings, if you watch what I got right and wrong on Monday night, what I said in that video was that I think if you look at the defenses in Thursday Night Football so far, they're not playing as great, especially when they're kind of injured. And Arizona, they do have a little bit of injury concern on that defensive side of the ball. And Kenneth Walker's had a good 2 weeks. So the confidence is high. The momentum is good with Seattle. I think Kenneth Walker still has a solid day, even with Zach Charbonnet back and definitely getting touches. Now, Jordan Mason's at 13. And listen, this guy was fantastic. But really, the whole team was against the Cincinnati Bengals. But Jordan Mason clearly was the engine that made that offense move because the quarterback play is still subpar. Now, they go to overseas. I think it's in Ireland to go play the Pittsburgh Steelers. I hate these overseas games because I never know what to expect from either team's offense or defense for that matter. I think it's a very tricky situation to go overseas and play, so I don't know what to expect, and I think that Pittsburgh's run defense has looked a little bit better over the past couple of weeks, so it's a little hard for me to know what the matchup really looks like versus the Pittsburgh Steelers defense as opposed to what it looked like last week for the Cincinnati Bengals. And I've got Amarian Hampton at 14 and Chuba Hubbard at 15. And listen, Amarian Hampton had his breakout party. There's no question about it. The guy looked much better on the ground versus a really brutal defense, by the way. So Amarian Hampton, at this point, I've got to say, he's got to go back inside your lineups because he's taking on the Giants this week in New York, and that matchup, in theory, is a really good one. Now, I will say, a lot of people might find it unfair that he's already above Chuba Hubbard, who has been mostly very good in fantasy. Now, last week he didn't get in the end zone, and that was a result of him not having as good of a fantasy day. Because if you look at the first 2 weeks, he had largely been kind of inefficient on the ground, but he got in the end zone to save his weeks. So I do think that's a big reason why I'm putting Chuba behind Amarian Hampton, because Hampton is on the better offense, number one, and he's seeing so much work. There's no Rico Dowdle, for example, with the Los Angeles Chargers. With Chuba, there is Rico Dowdle, and he did get the touchdown last week from Chuba Hubbard. So with him taking on the New England Patriots in New England, the matchup in theory is decent, but I do think that he is in a position to where he's not seeing the full workload like Amarian Hampton is in Los Angeles, especially with Najee Harris out. J.K. Dobbins is at 16, and Travis Etienne is at 17, and J.K. Dobbins is taking on the glorious matchup of the Cincinnati Bengals at home. It's a Monday night game, and I expect Denver to absolutely whoop up on the Cincinnati Bengals. I think that the Bengals defense is already bad, and you add on the fact that Denver's offense has actually looked pretty good on the ground, and when you look at the usage of the running backs on FSRoundup.com, you can see that J.K. Dobbins has not only been the lead back, but it's actually getting wider, the margin of touches between him and R.J. Harvey and Tyler Bidet. J.K. Dobbins is the lead back in this offense, point blank, end of story. He should be in the majority of lineups in fantasy football at this point because he's been a very consistent touchdown threat, and I can confidently say that that continues because he's running behind one of the best offensive lines in football, taking on one of the best matchups in fantasy football. And then with Travis Etienne at San Francisco this week, listen, the matchup I don't love, and I get it. San Francisco's dealing with tons of injuries offensively and defensively. Nick Bosa just tore his ACL. So, there's a legitimate opportunity here, but I still believe in Robert Saleh as a defensive coordinator, and Travis Etienne is sharing some work with Bayshul Tootin. He got in the end zone last week. Now, Etienne did at the end of the game as well to salvage his week, but Travis Etienne, my point being, is that I still don't know if I see a completely dominant player against the San Francisco 49ers front seven. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I've got Breece Hall at number 18 and Alvin Kamara at 19. Now, Breece Hall, yes, it feels weird to put Breece over Kamara because if you look at the workload distribution between the two guys, Breece Hall splits touches on a weekly basis basically with Braylon Allen. Not a complete 50-50 split, but there is a split going on there. With Kamara, it's mostly him and occasionally a Kendre Miller to come in and spell him on certain plays. So it does feel weird. And I do think that the offense of the Jets is not good with or without Justin Fields. But the matchup versus Miami has me in on Breece Hall this week. I would play him over Kamara because this matchup is fantastic. And we saw the efficiency of the back when he played a bad running defense versus Pittsburgh in week 1. I think this Miami matchup is very opportunistic for Breece. Whereas with Kamara, it's the exact opposite. Buffalo is not a good matchup. I mean, I get it. Their defense wasn't very good last week. But if you actually look at what Devon Achane did on the ground, well, he wasn't that great either. So I think Alvin Kamara on a worse offense even, and I think that's really hard to believe. Alvin Kamara's in just a bad position this week. Because if you look at what they did last week against a better defense with Seattle, it just wasn't very encouraging. So I think Breece is the better play over Kamara. Ashton Genty's at 20, and Trey Benson lands at 21. So with Ashton Genty, the dude had to drop. I mean, it's just not been very good. And listen, Ashton Genty, the problem is not the work. If you actually look at the workload on FS Roundup, he's their clear lead back by far and away. There's no contest. And Chicago's matchup, I really don't think is that bad. But I do think Ashton Genty just isn't efficient right now. And I don't know if it's him always or if it's the offensive line in part. I think it's the offensive line that has a big reason to do with this. But he hasn't been in the end zone yet, and his work out of the backfield with catches, it's just not enough yet. So Ashton Genty, I still just don't believe in this Raiders offense enough to put him much higher than this week. And it's unfortunate because he is seeing the workload. But with Trey Benson, I'm not confident yet. I like Trey Benson a lot. And again, I hate to be the wet blanket on things because I know I want to play Trey Benson. I've got him in all my dynasty leagues. I've got him in a bunch of redraft leagues. I took Trey Benson everywhere this year. He was my most drafted player. I want to play him. I'm not going to play him if I don't have to this week, though. It's against a brutal matchup versus Seattle's defense. And yes, I did say earlier in the video that Thursday night defenses are actually an opportunity you want to take advantage of, especially when they're injured, what the Seahawks defense is. So Trey Benson, in theory, the matchup is not as bad as it looks on paper, but I will say that Amari DeMarcado in on third downs last week after James Conner went down, I think that eats into Benson's workload a little bit. So I would rather see how the week plays out with Trey Benson's workload before I put him on my lineup. But obviously, if you're desperate, Trey Benson's a solid play this week. Quinshon Judkins is at 22, and David Montgomery is back inside my top 30. Quinshon Judkins at 22 at the Detroit Lions, and Monty in the same matchup. Listen, with Quinshon Judkins, this guy rocked last week. Like, he was fantastic against one of the best defenses in the league. So it's hard to see, based on last week and how it went for him, not finishing inside the top 15. I get this may feel like a low ranking for people. If you want to know where my head's at with Quinshon Judkins, it's that I still don't trust this Cleveland offense. Like, even last week in a win versus Green Bay, they only won because they held Green Bay to 10 points. They got 13 points out of the equation. So it's not like their offense was this super dominant, power system that was just like charged by Quinshon Judkins to get them in the red zone 4 times in the game. That's just not the way that it worked. And Detroit's defense coming off that big of a performance versus the Baltimore Ravens offense, I just have trouble seeing Quinshon Judkins do similar work to last week against the Detroit defense coming off that type of performance. Dave Montgomery versus the Cleveland Browns, I think, is in a position to where the matchup is amazing on the other hand. I think the matchup is fantastic, but listen, David Montgomery, I wasn't big on this offseason, so I'm probably a little bit on the slower end of getting more hyped up about Monty's performance, which last week against the Ravens defense, it was fantastic. But I will say that I'm probably a little slower to the party on this one because I still do see Jahmyr Gibbs as the clear better back in this offense if you look at the first 2 weeks of fantasy football, excluding week 3 versus the Baltimore Ravens. I do think David Montgomery could take a step back this week, but the matchup is definitely opportunistic. Dropping down to our next tier, I've got Javonte Williams at 24 and DeAndre Swift at 25. Javonte Williams versus the Packers, I think the matchup's just really tough. And listen, I'm not doubting that Javonte is, in theory, more important to this offense this week without CeeDee Lamb. And he actually did pretty well last week against the Bears, all things considered. Now, he wasn't his dominant performance like he had in the first 2 weeks against the Chicago Bears. But I do think that Javonte in this matchup versus Green Bay, it's hard to imagine that he puts much better of a performance up against their defense than he did against the Bears defense. So I get it. People have said I've been low on Javonte for the majority of the season so far. I understand where you're coming from, but at the same time, I'm not capitulating to that against the Green Bay Packers. And then DeAndre Swift at the Vegas Raiders. The matchup in theory is fantastic. It was fantastic last week, and he hasn't done much. I mean, listen, Swift has been fine. He's like the RB20, I think, through the first 3 games in fantasy football. So he's been fine, but it's not exceeding expectations, and I don't think it's meeting my expectations because I was bigger on him than the majority over the offseason. So Swift has been a little bit of a disappointment in my eyes, but the matchup, again, against the Raiders is a fantastic one in theory. But last week, I saw that same level of matchup and him just not coming through. That being said, he is clearly seeing the workload, and I do think that Swift is still a guy that could pop off for a 20, 25-point game, but I'm not going to predict it happening in any particular week. I'll let it happen before I predict it. Jaylen Warren's at 26, and Chase Brown lands at 27 to round us out. Jaylen Warren at the Minnesota Vikings overseas in Ireland. Again, the matchup I think is not good for Jaylen Warren this week. And I get it. Jaylen Warren has actually been a really solid back this year. If you actually look at what he's done this year, he's been a top-end RB2 in fantasy football. Now, I do think that his involvement in the passing game probably lifts him to a higher performance than this if you look at the first 3 weeks of the season. But I will say that the matchup versus Minnesota is just not the one that I want to take advantage of. Like, I would just rather play a bunch of guys that I've named above him over Jaylen Warren because the matchup I don't like. And again, I think going overseas, particularly at Aaron Rodgers' age, is not an ideal matchup in an ideal situation when you're playing the Vikings in that matchup. So I'll go ahead and try to bench as many Steelers as I can this week overseas. And then with Chase Brown at number 27, listen, I said this leading into the week and even leading into last week, which is that I don't think this offense in Cincinnati will be that bad moving forward. I mean, they were inept in fantasy football. Like, you can't play those options if we're going to see that the entire season. The reality is we won't, but this week is bad. I mean, Denver's defense in Denver this week, they're coming off 2 brutal losses. Like, they're going to be pissed. And I think that the Bengals are going to be beaten like a redheaded stepchild. Like, there's just no avoiding that. So I wouldn't play Chase Brown this week, but I still consider him a buy low because people are out on him. Like, OUT out. There's no coming back from what he just did in fantasy last week. So I do still consider him a buy low, but if you bought him this week, I would not play him this week if you had the option to not. Now, dropping down to our last tier, it's Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt at 28, and Tony Pollard is at 29. I like the matchup. I think that he's a really good player. I think he's their most explosive back, and I don't particularly know the reason why they're not using him the majority of the time. But that's the reality, and you have to look at it for what it is, and Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt's upside remains limited. And Tony Pollard at the Houston Texans this week, the matchup is not very good. And I get it. Houston has been bad, and their defense is flat out just on the field too much for them to hold offenses to minimal points on a weekly basis because their offense is atrocious. But at the same time, Tennessee's offense has been bad. And last week I predicted that Pollard would have his best game, and he did, but it still didn't amount to that much upside. I just don't think Pollard's that great of a player, and I don't think this offense has gotten any better from where I saw them in week 1. I've got Tony Pollard at 29 because the offense's upside as a whole is just really low. And then Cam Scatterboo is at 30 to round out the whole list right here, and he's taking on the Chargers. Listen, if it was the matchup versus the Carolina Panthers or the Cleveland Browns or the Cincinnati Bengals, I would be much higher on Cam Skattebo. I mean, listen, last week against the Chiefs defense, that's a tough run defense. He put up a really good performance, and he's got the backfield basically to himself with Tyrone Tracy out now. So I do still see Cam Skattebo potentially finishing higher than this because he's got the workload on his side. But at the same time, I do think that this matchup, and I said it earlier this week with the wide receiver rankings, it's a brutal start for Jackson Dart's career. So I don't see the Giants offense looking that much better than they did with Russ this week alone because they're playing the Chargers. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for week 4 fantasy football, click on this video right here.